Hey everybody, we are back with Urza's Command Center Custom, and I was going to take all the components out here, but we actually have a full fresh charge in our duster, and, well, I was thinking about it more. I think it might be easier to kind of leave it in place first, then pull everything out, then clean out the case, and then we can go ahead and start reinstalling cleaned components. So, I didn't want to spare you guys the ever so satisfying part of getting in there with this fine little brush and really scraping stuff clean and off. And then, of course, as we go, we can loosen up with a toothbrush to get that exactly the way we want it prior to taking it out for a much deeper clean. So, without further ado, let's get started. Well, after that, which is pretty preliminary cleaning, look how much dust got caught in this rear filter. I mean, it's basically caked. This is probably the most dust I've ever blown out of a system. I was underestimating it a little bit because now it's kind of all over my bar table. So I'm going to have to clean this off too. But if we look a little bit deeper, give you guys a little light there, you can see it's much, much cleaner than it was, although not yet, of course, anywhere near perfect. But let's go ahead and get a little bit of a toothbrush deeper clean and blow it out, and then we'll start harvesting out the components and cleaning up the workspace and then getting everything cleaned up in the case. All right, so we've gone at it with a toothbrush for a good while here, and I do that for a couple of reasons. One, because the toothbrush cleans a lot of the surface dust that doesn't simply blow off. I like to call it visceral dust. Kind of like visceral fat, it's the hardest stuff to get off of the body of whatever you're cleaning. So like the interior of the fan here tends to retain a good hard layer of dust right up against where the blade sweeps through. To get rid of that, you really got to get in there and really brush around, sort of like cleaning plaque off your molars, your back molars. Same thing with the case. I mean, you know, it's a little less important to clean the case, but honestly, if we're going for overall hygiene and wellness of the system, you really want to get in there and kind of work every nook and cranny. Even the unused spaces, I mean, it's just really dust collection at that point. You know, the surface of the metal, again, not critical to the operation of the system, but certainly is going to extend the life of whatever you're using. Now, you can do this on your current system and really preserve its runtime. You can kind of save it from long-term damaging effects of dust by simply just keeping it clean. Now, the other thing that the toothbrush is good for, and why I keep it in my toolkit, is on this little blower here. You can see it gets pretty caked. And the easiest way to clean this, just like that. So we'll just free up some more of that airspace. And you can see, I mean, just the amount of dust we're blowing around is pretty amazing. Just big old chunks. And this isn't even like chunks that were in the case. This is just ambient air dust that it was sucking in while we were blowing dust out of the case. So if that tells you anything about how dirty this thing was, certainly it's pretty telling. It's kind of no wonder this thing didn't last any longer than it did. Although it makes you wonder, if it did last 12 years already, what would have happened if I kept it clean like I was supposed to? Now you're probably wondering, and I did see it in the comments on the first video, why did you kind of let this one go? Well, somebody answered for me and said it was college, different priorities. And yeah, absolutely. Not to mention the fact that I had no idea this system was going to last me that long. I figured this would last me through college, and then maybe afterwards I'd get a new computer. And to be honest, I just really, after college, didn't need a computer. So it was more of a fun machine and, do whatever I want with it. And, it worked. So I just never upgraded or replaced it. So we're going to switch now to our focus blast and go ahead and blast out some more of the dust from the system. That's probably going to get out about as much as we're going to get without disassembling. So after that, I'm just going to quick dust the workspace off and then we're going to go ahead and pull out our components. We'll take a look at each one as we take it out. And then, of course, we still have to clean our nasty graphics card. And some of the individual components that come out we'll have to toothbrush clean as well. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and blast this. Well, after that 2 minutes of dusting, you can see we're still getting good sized chunks out of there. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the front panel here because I can see that there's still dust trapped in there as well. I'm going to go ahead and continue blowing this out, but I will spare you the boring details of that, and we'll get into some of the components here next. Okay, so cleaning up memory is fairly easy because it's all right here. And I like to just give it a good old toothbrush, dust off. You see how much in just a little bit of effort you get off there. You put a little bit more time into this and it'll look like the other side here, brand new. Typically memory gets dusty on one side, usually the side where the fan is either blowing dust into it or sucking dust past it. Now depending on the type of motherboard you're looking at, the age of it, you may have kind of bi-directional, so it could potentially be dusty on both sides, or it may be oriented in such a way that, you know, the airflow and therefore the dust flow connects you with all around dust. So if it's flowing on both sides, you might get caked on both sides. Now, I would say, you know, just be cautious of these pins. I like to just run a finger on them. It doesn't hurt anything. I definitely think back in the day I was a little more ginger with my components. But the fact of the matter is there's plenty of this stuff at the junkyard. So if I roach one stick of memory, it is not the end of the world. That being said, obviously keep it away from anything magnetized. You know, do your best to preserve what you're working with. See, now this stick was an interior stick, not nearly as dusty. It's got a little bit of surface dust. Give it a quick once over. Now these low profiles are dusty on both sides, and that's probably because they are so small and the dust that was blowing into the stick behind it blew back into these and was trapped because it was low, there wasn't enough airflow, and that's one drawback to the sort of low profile memory form factor. And why, you know, it's more popular in machines like laptops where you don't have that kind of same dust flow. Not to say they don't get dusty in laptops, they certainly do. But again, pretty easy to clean up. Run it over with the toothbrush. Not a whole lot you have to do with memory. I mean, it could take a little bit of rubbing alcohol and really clean this down. But in all honesty, I don't know that we're going to even need these sticks of memory. If this machine fires up, we might be able to find some higher capacity and boost this machine's overall performance that way. Again, this is DDR2, so it's fairly dated at this point, but that's not to say that it's not usable, and that with enough memory, you might not be able to run a modern system. Probably not Windows 11, but certainly Windows 10, which I think I even had running on this machine prior to when it didn't start. So this one is real bad. This must have been as close to the processor where a lot of your dust tends to go. Again, anywhere by those fans. Beneath the power supply or next to the processor. Definitely makes you wonder about those cartridge processors, how they trap dust back in the day. I've not had that issue in a long time, so I don't remember cleaning them because at the time technology was changing so fast. You really didn't have a cart processor for very long. You pretty much upgraded to a P3 that was a chip on board or an AMD Athlon or something. That was, again, you know, slot chip rather than a cartridge. Although I do like the cartridges. I think it's such a neat form factor. I kind of wish they would bring that back with a modern day chip. I think it'd be, for cooling reasons alone, it would be much more efficient. You could give it its own dedicated power right off the power supply as opposed to going through the board with a 4-pin, 6-pin, or 8-pin connector. Likewise, you wouldn't have to have that auxiliary fan plug there, and you could use that fan plug for something completely different. I don't know. If anybody has any insight as to why they went away from that, I'd be very interested to know. But memory is all cleaned up. I think at this point we are going to pull the case components before we even clean the graphics card, and then we'll go through them here in a little bit. Okay, so I think we're going to start with just the motherboard, unplugging some of the front panel peripherals. Take up this auxiliary USB. Although I have to say, the idea of having dedicated USB on a back panel is kind of novel, but it's very much unnecessary this day and age, especially since I'm not going to be running too many components off of USB for this machine, so we'll just take that out of there, probably for good at this point, but you never know. I'm going to pull this back fan, and these are typically kind of a bear to take out for one reason or another, mostly because they actually bite into the fan itself as opposed to simply locking on with like a press connector. These screws that they used, I love them because they hold it really nicely, but I sort of hate them too because they hold it too nicely. But you can see here that visceral dust I was talking about. No matter how much you blow, you still have to kind of scrape that away to really truly clean this up. This is a really nice fan, very low noise when it's working properly. Again, I'm not sure if that fan is at its end of its life, or if it was just kind of making some noise, but hopefully, anyway, it's just noisy because of the dust, and we can get it working pretty easily. Go ahead and take off our cooling tower here. You can see the visceral dust on the backside, and definitely this compound was probably not enough to keep it cool, although it worked for a long time. But this is going to need to get really cleaned off really deeply to make sure we have good compound connection in the future. And our processor's trapping a couple dust bunnies there. But you can see we've got an Athlon 64 dual core, and that one ran at, well, this is a 2005 chip, so it's an older chip. I can't remember exactly what the processing speed was. I think it was 1.6 maybe, so not the strongest socket AM2 processor. So I'm hoping that maybe I might have another processor that might work a little bit better, faster, to upgrade this board. I'm going to try it with all original hardware when we get it cleaned up, just to see how well it runs on its own, if at all, I should say. And of course, if it doesn't run, well, we'll start by swapping the processor, because it could be that that processor just finally gave out after 12 years of hard labor. That being said, too, we've got a unique setup here for this cooling fan. I'm thinking this footprint might match some of the other cooling fans I have, and or perhaps the extra liquid cooler I have. So I might be tempted to try and upgrade this to a liquid cooler, although finding space for that might be nearly impossible in this case. But something to think about in the future too, just because, extra components laying around, if we're trying to maximize performance for this board, overclocking is certainly a potential if we can get decent cooling. Boy, even these screws have visceral dust caked onto them. So hopefully this cleans up really well. And, I like this case, but I do have other cases that would fit this board. that may work just as well. So, there's always something to consider there with just which case we put it in. So if I can't fit a liquid cooler in here, and or if I want to do more cooling fans, swap of a case may be the ticket there as well. So I'm kind of impressed with myself in 2008. I didn't cut any corners when it came to sinking down the screws on this processor, or on this motherboard. It must have came with the right amount of screws, because in my dorm room I definitely did not have like a backstock of replacement screws should I need them. And I didn't have any extra components because of, well, being a broke college kid, basically. So that all being said, I kind of went pretty ham on building this machine from the jump. So, I think it's just, again, a testament to how long this thing lasted. And again, just speaks to, you don't have to upgrade your processor every single generation. Honestly, the performance really doesn't change a whole lot. All right, so let's take a look at the back of the motherboard. There's one of those big dust bunnies. Cooling plate looks good. I mean, honestly, I don't see any heat damage here, so I'm feeling really positive that this might be savable, all things considered. I am a little bummed there's no AGP slot on here. I've been looking for a machine to test out that AGP video card, but no avail so far. So we'll set the motherboard off to the side, and then as far as the front panel components go, I think we're just going to leave them in there. They're not hurting anything or helping anything by coming out, but I did want to point out that there's standoffs in here that we could move around if we wanted to reconfigure to a different board. I'm not going to do that right now, but there's always that potential in the future. All right, so we have the motherboard out, and you can see we've got a couple areas of, again, that visceral dust I keep coming back to. We've got some right over here by the PCB standoff, made in Taiwan. Interesting. We've got a little bit on the back side here of this silent pipe cooler. That's probably the worst of it. We've got a couple of small dust bunnies here. Those will clean up just fine. And then I really want to dig in with a toothbrush and clean out this processor area. We've definitely got some clogging up the memory here and around the memory. And that was after blowing out all that dust you saw earlier. So we're going to start with a good old-fashioned elbow grease toothbrush. And there's even some on this heatsink that looked like spotless when I was pulling it out. So the relay here has some, but you see how easy it comes off. Well, you can't see it on the camera right now, but it comes off pretty easy, and stuff comes up pretty clean. Checking the capacitors just with the finger as I go. I don't think any of these are bulging, so I think that's good. I mean, again, given the age, my main concern is I don't want any of these components to pop when I plug it back in and try and get it fired back up. But overall, again, honestly, this thing ran constantly for 12 years. I mean, I barely turned this thing off. I mean, it was almost always on. I had a graphic screensaver, so it's not like the GPU was ever like just hanging out doing nothing. I mean, it's seen its service life. So, typical computer can probably go, about a decade before it really needs any major maintenance or upgrades. And this one ran almost 24 hours a day for basically, of the 12 years I had it running, it probably ran 24 hours a day, probably, let's say 8 of those years total, just to be conservative. But again, that's a conservative number. I might be underestimating it. That being said, I do find that if you leave the computer on, it tends to run a little bit better than if you're shutting it down all the time. Now, somebody can correct me on that. I could very easily be wrong. But I put a lot of high demand on my computers. I always kind of figured, if this thing dies, it's been around X long, whatever. And honestly, after college, again, I really didn't have a use for a computer other than real recreation. So playing games or, making video, whatever. And it wasn't like I was using it for, a business or a podcast at the time. So although there was a very short-lived experimental podcast I did before the Digital Escape podcast, and that crew, of course, has now become Digital Escape. So just as a reminder, if you haven't been over to Digital Escape Podcast here on YouTube, go ahead and type that in your search bar and check us out. We've got a couple of different podcasts on there. Digital Escape Podcast, the Melt Off Podcast, and the Warp Core Podcast, which I'm sure you can probably guess, but that's about Star Trek. Again, overall, this machine was really used for pretty low demand recreation. So, in all things, it really wasn't, wasn't playing Crisis on this, although I think it probably could have handled it, but that's not really my kind of game. You may be surprised to learn I actually don't really even care for first-person type games, first-person shooters especially. I've always been more of an RPG guy or a simulation guy, although I don't play games like Goat Simulator because I don't understand the appeal, I guess. A lot of people love it though, so I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying it's not for me. And if you listen to the Digital Escape podcast, just as an FYI, I'm not shitting on anybody when I tell people that they make the same game over and over and over and I hate it. That's me playing up a bit of a character there, hyperbolizing my true opinion, which is I am a little sick of first-person shooter games, but I respect the fact that a lot of people love them. But yeah, again, this computer was never used for that because it wasn't really my thing. I feel pretty good about that. The board looks immaculately clean. Obviously not nearly as clean as it was back in the day, but it, is never going to be brand new again either. So let's go ahead and clean up the graphics card, then we can talk about reassembly. All right, here is our graphics card. This one is loaded with gunk and just disgusting overall. This one, I think we're going to have to pull this heatsink off just because it is so caked. But I think we're going to go ahead and just give it a blowout first and just see how much of it we can get. All right, well, I gotta say I'm pleasantly surprised. Quite a bit came out. Again, a lot of visceral dust in there that needs to be cleaned out, but pretty impressed. The one thing is I had the motherboard sitting just next to me and that just got full of dust again. So I'm gonna have to blow that off and then we'll take this heatsink off and start cleaning that fan in beneath. All right, heatsink off. You can see the visceral dust again. We're gonna go ahead and pull that cord, give that a nice scrub down. We're gonna clean up the GPU, get some fresh thermal paste on that before we reassemble. And that'll be kind of our last cleaning step before we move towards reassembly. Now when we do the reassembly here, I'm going to do it in a part 3 video because this one I'm sure has been a little long for you guys to sit through. But overall, hope you enjoyed it. I definitely think we're going to have a nice working machine after this. And then it's just going to be a matter of, well, honestly, just finding a hard drive and getting this thing back in ship shape. Hope you enjoyed.